As you can see by the title, the town of Sabinov stands in the center of my presentation. The story of the town goes back to more centuries, and with developed booming economy and trade, it was one of the most powerful towns in the whole of Upper Hungary in the course of Middle Ages. At the same time, the role of the former royal free city and its thriving medieval urban life resulted in a well-documented history from the 14th to 19th century. The remaining sources are greatly complex, holding information about both life of middle social groups and development of the city itself. After all, the development and history of Sabinov is known from the point of view of how it became a free royal city, when and what new privileges were given by some kings, how it fit into the political relations of the country. However, it is worthwhile to look at what events took place on lower levels inside the city. It has been less researched how the lives of citizens evolved in these times, what problems they had, with whom, and how the city council worked. However, the volume of the files and the scope limits require the scope of investigation to be confined to a certain time interval, which in this case is 1446 and 1447. The choice of dates was justified by the fact that the Chronicle of Sabinov was introduced in 1446, and from that period several large records were read, including the names of the 12 jurors. Therefore, the goal is to show some interesting pieces of the city life with the help of the mentioned sources. As I have mentioned, I had used two types of sources during the research. The Chronicle of Sabinov, which is a book containing mainly legal procedures, began to be kept during the judges of George Kramer. During the centuries and following the politics, the language of writing has changed accordingly, so besides most of the Latin notes, there are German ones and a smaller part, especially for the 19th century, in Hungarian. Here you can see the front page of the book, and this is the second one. Its entries are valuable sources in this case, but not only for medieval urban life, because they point out the everyday life of the inhabitants, but most importantly, their problems. Family relations could also be well reconstructed on the basis of the chronicle, in order to research the contact system present within the city. This fits into the investigation of city officials. Some of the entries in the city book describe in detail the members of the council. In most cases, they only mark the chief judge, but we cannot meet the names of the 12 jurors in more than one place. This allows yearly comparisons and investigations to see how offices were exchanged every year, which families were the most influential in the era, who held power in their hands. The other very important sources are the charters concerning Sabinov. These letters of privilege, legal insurance documents, contributed to the rise of the city. Most of them can be found in the Hungarian database of DLDF. But before presenting the research in more detail, it is worth considering the town of Sabinov a little from a public historical point of view. The first original charter, which can be found in the DF, confirming Sabinov's existence at the beginning of the 14th century, is the transcription of the Szepes or Peace Chamber from 1395. At this time, the town's flourishing trade is already pointed out by Queen Elizabeth's privilege letter issued in 1371. Certainly, the economic power of the city, already present at the time, also contributed to the fact that Sigismund of Luxembourg made Sabinov a free royal city in 1405, thereby winning the rights of Košice. The year 1442 is crucial for the town. At this time, Queen Elizabeth grants the city a comprehensive, complete exemption from tax. The decision of the Queen is probably linked to the inland fights that prevail in the country. By freeing Sabinov from all taxes, she made sure that it remained faithful to her and his son Leslie V. For 1442, the armies of Vladislav I recovered more and more areas against the forces supporting Leslie V. The only territory that successfully resisted the longest was Upper Hungary. The area was under the supervision of Czech mercenary leader Jan Giskra, whom Elizabeth managed to put on her own party in 1440. The stalemate was resolved by the peace agreement between the opposing parties in 1442. In 1446, under these political conditions, they began to lead the book of the Royal Free City of Sabinov. The first entry indicated purpose and mode of leadership. The name of the judge, George Kramer, can be read along with the names of the 12 jurors. The Council of the City Council was elected annually by the citizens. George Kramer has registered several inheritance issues and a very complex house acquisition, namely a stone house. Already, this fact foreshadows several things. First, as a stone house, only a wealthier citizen could afford it. The house, although its location is not localized in the text, must have been located on or very close to the main square of the city, since in the Middle Ages, stone structures were mostly built along the main street, the main square. The streets running next to and behind this were dotted with houses made of wood or thatches, and possession of real estate was important even because civil rights were tied to it. After examining the text of the chronicle, we get to know that George Zindram was the buyer and Matthias Zindram was the seller, and the stone house was sold for 100 gold forints. According to the agreement, George should have paid the amount of 5 forints for the first year, probably every month, and after that, on the basis of further discussion, with a 2-year deadline, the remaining amount. George Zindram has paid in advance of 44 forints, whose father-in-law, Lawrence Such from Levoca, lent this amount. However, due to the so-called confusing times, George retreated from the purchase and did not pay off his debt after 2 years. Instead, he sold the house and the plot for it to John Schober, so that he did not pay his debt to Matthias Zindram. As Matthias knew that George was unable to settle his debt, he turned to the city council to give him justice. Eventually, he got his former stone house and its plot back from the court. Matthias Zindram probably turned to the city council with confidence about his case, since if we examine the jury list, 2 citizens named Zindram appear in the same year. There is no certainty about the relationship between the plaintiff and the jurors, but in my opinion they must have been related to each other. It is not just a simple coincidence of name. Note that this was the system in Bratislava as well, when in the 15th century a rule was made forbidding participation of relatives in the council. The name Zindram appears in a debt settlement even in 1458, but after that we do not see that name in the chronicle again. However, there is no doubt that in the first trimester of the 15th century it was a very influential and wealthy family, as is well reflected from the above, and this is confirmed by the following. The Zindram family was not only present in the political life of Sabinov in the 1440s. In his 1434 diploma of King Sigismund reaffirming the privilege of Sabinov, the name Zindram also appears. This is the given charter that I'm talking about. The original document can be found in the archive of Prešov, but this is the digital copy. The other juror citizens who is even more worthy to look closely in a similar way is John Schönviser. His name was the first member of the jury during George Kramer's court, but he had already become involved in the political life of Sabinov. According to a diploma issued by King Albert, this is what you can see here, in 1439 Schönviser had the position of judiciary. As urban law required that only a citizen who had been a member of the ordinary council for at least a year could become a judge, and of course had sufficient existence, hence housing and capital, so Schönviser could begin his political career at a very young age, considering that even in 1461 he was found among the officials repeatedly as a judge. In 1447, however, as a juror, he asked the Peace Chamber, together with Gregory List and Anthony Borsus, to rewrite Sigismund's diploma issued in 1434. The name of John Schönviser appears on the pages of the Sabinov Chronicle 3 more times until 1461. That year was important not only for Schönviser but also for the city of Sabinov. In addition to finally settling the succession dispute between the Dapper and the Gögelbach family, lasting since 1458, the construction of the Church of St. John the Baptist has also begun. However, the construction did not originate from the development of the city, but from its reconstruction. Young Giscra, who was strengthened under Leslie V, continued to keep the cities of Upper Hungary under his control, and with the support of his chaste soldiers, he confronted King Matthias. The war against the mercenary leader reached the city in 1461, when the whole city was burned down by the army. However, even though the armies of Giscra burned Sabinum completely, the city remained on the side of the Hungarian king and continued to support his forces. Matthias, in order to repay this help, promised payment for the reconstruction of the burned St. John Church. What is also interesting about Schönviser's identity is that only 2 of the entries in the book report acts of violence both related to the former judge. The first was in 1456, when Goldenbach spoke against the judgment, which unfortunately has no background in detail, and addressed disparaging words to the officials of the city. Since such an act was severely punishable not only in Sabinov but also in other cities, Goldenbach could not avoid the verdict and was condemned to death. In 1460, Michael Neuberger said similar things in the pub against the leadership of the then judge John Fillat. The case was handled by Schönviser, who, as they wrote, first went for his horses, then caught Neuberger when he found him in the pub. What kind of judgment he was then condemned is no longer detailed, but probably the same fate awaited him as Goldenbach. Talking about judges and jurors, we should mention some other names that can appear in the book. Examples include Peter, the son of Sigismund, who reappears as juror after his court in 1476. His and Paul Glotz's one-year judicial position hinders the Kasher family's political career for decades. From 1464 to 1482, the 2 members of the Kasher family, Peter and Martin, changed each other in the judiciary. In view of this, there is no doubt that in the second half of the 15th century, the most influential house of Sabinov could emerge from this family. And it also shows that at the time, a strange political power curse has formed in the city. In itself, the Chronicle of Sabinov is a very important source for reconstructing how one of the major cities of Upper Hungary worked in the Middle Ages. However, because of the inconsistent bookkeeping, it is also essential to use other resources that complement the missed parts, thereby giving a more complete picture of how the city has been operated. The examination of the Chronicle is also important from a different perspective, and this is the angle of view of ordinary people at the time. Through their lawsuits and stories, the things and problems revealed that the diplomats are silent about. And that is the reason why it is so important to examine those stories that are in the Chronicle. Although the research is in its infancy, I tried to introduce some little unknown fragments of the medieval city life. As the further parts of the examination, I would like to delineate the network of the citizens and their relationships. And thank you for your attention.